Good afternoon and welcome to What's Next, National Politics at the Local Level, presented by WHYY in partnership with the Pennsylvania Humanities Council. I'm your moderator, Solomon Jones, columnist for WHYY and The Inquirer, and a radio host at WURD and Classics 1079. A politically divided Pennsylvania was thrust into the national spotlight during the contentious 2020 national election. It tested the foundations of our democracy at all levels of government. The aftermath left the state with evenly split congressional representation and increasingly inflexible partisanship from all sides. Today, we'll explore how tensions and fractures on national issues are playing out in local Pennsylvania politics, no matter where you stand on national debates about things like gun control and immigration and abortion. Urgent community issues like safety in schools and infrastructure repairs and clean water are often decided at the local level, and solutions can transcend the national rhetoric. How do national politics impact local decision-making, and what's next for Pennsylvania in this new era of hyper-polarization? Here to talk about it is a distinguished panel of experts. Let's meet them now. Susan Spka is Executive Director of Education Voters of Pennsylvania, a community organizer and former teacher. She co-founded Education Matters in the Cumberland Valley, a grassroots organization. Most importantly, Susan, who holds several advanced degrees, has two daughters who attend public schools. Susan, welcome. And David Thornburg is president and CEO of the Committee of 70. He served as executive director of the University of Pennsylvania's Fels Institute of Government, executive director of the Economy League of Greater Philadelphia, and director of the Wharton Small Business Development Center. He lives in Philadelphia. David, welcome.
Thank you, Solomon.
And Katie Meyer is WHYY's political reporter. Prior to coming to Philadelphia, Katie was WITF's Capitol Bureau Chief and covered all things state politics for public radio stations throughout the state. Welcome, Katie. Good to see you again.
For having me.
All right. So let's begin with two issues that have kind of defined the last year in politics and our lives: COVID-19 and education. WHYY reporters traveled the state. They spoke to voters, and in Lebanon County, where Republicans outnumbered Democrats by an almost 2-to-1 margin, there were very different viewpoints on both issues. We start with Anna Fink. She's a Democrat, and she had this to say.
I'm looking for taking so much of the partisan politics out of the school boards, and put the energy more on the well-being of the teachers and the students. The logical, logical reactions to things that are happening. And all I can tell you for sure, and this is the best I'm going to be able to do, is that there were plenty of times with my daughter has pre-existing conditions where I was fearful that if she got COVID, it could kill her. And there was almost a coldness about anybody who felt that way or wanted to fight to be safe.
And then there was Linda Good. She's a Republican, and she had this to say.
So yeah, it's got to come down to the schools. They have to walk a narrow line between keeping government, and the mandates that they are given. They've got to watch those and probably comply to the degree that they must. But at the same time, they've got to start letting the kids have sports. They've got to start letting them interact as they're supposed to. This is a development process, the human development process for these kids, where they're not only learning the basic math and arithmetic, or math, English, and et cetera, they are also learning to get along with their peers and how to adjust to living in a community. And these kind of restrictions that they've been going through for the last almost year and a half now are not going to work well for them. And many kids will suffer much more than we realize.
So we'll start with you, Susan. You're a parent with children in public schools. Now, on one hand, you have a parent saying, look, my daughter could die from COVID. On the other hand, you have a citizen who's saying, look, the kids could be harmed socially if they don't interact. Does this argument sound familiar to you? And how do you bridge that divide?
So this is the argument I think that communities have had for the past year, as we've had 9, elected school board members and a superintendent who've been faced with impossible decisions in 500 different school districts, with kind of not really strict guidance, but a lot of like leeway in deciding what to do at a local level because we're a local control state. On top of that, school districts had vastly different resources to use to either bring kids back to school or not. So some school districts have brand new buildings and they have lots of space and new ventilation systems. So to bring students back was something they could do safely. But other school districts had, overcrowded classrooms before COVID started. They didn't have enough staff to be able to split kids up. It was going to be a really unsafe situation for students to come back. And so these were difficult decisions that really tore communities apart. We have gotten past those, and what it's time for now is for us to come together as communities and recognize that with our schools that were shut down, our schools are the hearts of our communities. They are the place where we send our kids, where they get educated, and that offer our students so much more than just reading and writing, but they offer the socialization, they offer what we would hope would be like healthy, happy learning environments. And now, post-COVID, we need to come together to figure out how to make those schools work as well as possible for all of our students. And I think during COVID, we also saw the absence in some places of adequate resources. And so it's time for us to come together to make sure our schools come out of COVID stronger than they went in before. And we need to get past this divisiveness. That is water under the bridge. And what we don't want to do is elect slates of school board members who are going to come in with an agenda that's based on COVID when COVID isn't going to be an issue anymore, because I think we need to look at communities as a whole and how we can make our schools as good as possible for our kids coming out.
So Katie, you spoke with voters in different areas of the state. Was there a difference in how this issue played out in different counties? And did you find Democrats making Republican arguments, Republicans making Democratic arguments, or was everybody just speaking along these party lines?
It is interesting, Solomon. I think what I saw by and large was these debates breaking down on, the party lines that you might expect. And I think a lot of these issues, I think a school board is a really good example. I did a story about one school board in Bucks County where, these things really do turn into a proxy war. And all of people's, I think anxieties about these large political issues that they're struggling with, they manifest themselves in very local ways. And so, one of the issues I saw, or, not even really an issue, just a debate that was happening was in Bucks County, this school wanted to institute an anti-racist curriculum, like an explicitly anti-racist curriculum about police violence and just the ways that systemic racism can manifest. And there was a concerted backlash against that among a lot of parents and among the school board, which was completely Republican. So, I think especially in places like Bucks County, for instance, where the political geography has shifted really quickly. Bucks 10 years ago was a Republican stronghold and now has gotten more and more Democratic. You see these, frankly, culture clashes. And as, I think Susan spoke to, they trickle down to a very local level.
So, David, you look at how government operates. What are some of the best practices for handling something as personal as school, something as divisive as race in the midst of a crisis like this one? And do those best practices play out across party lines?
Yeah. Well, we live in a challenging political world. We live in a world where seemingly our political identity drives our beliefs and not the other way around. So if you're a Republican, you believe X, Y, and Z. If you're a Democrat, you believe X, Y, and Z, which is, I don't think, what our founding fathers intended. Look, in this area, as in all many of the challenges that we face relative to the pandemic and other things, I think the first order of business has got to be to bring down the temperature and to try to encourage folks, parents, teachers, administrators, anyone who's involved, to sort of see things from the ground up and not kind of take their perspective from the top down. And if we can knit back together some of those ground level relationships, with schools, parents, high school principals, and so forth, that strikes me as a more productive way to go. And I agree with Susan too. Like, let's just get over it. The good news is we're on the way out of this pandemic, and we've got to be focused again, in this case, on the job of educating kids.
So let's go to Western Pennsylvania. A mayor from there spoke about the continuing role of politics in our lives, even after the elections are over. Her name is Sharday Jones. She's the Democratic mayor of Braddock in Allegheny County. And this is what she had to say.
It seems like we never got out of the election cycle from November. We're just continually in an election cycle, literally over and over and over again. I kind of I don't understand why the Senate race is getting so much attention right now when we need attention on these municipal races, especially with some of the questions that are on the upcoming ballot.
Okay. So there's a lot in there. And I want to start with you, Katie. The
Sure.
mayor talked about us being in this permanent election cycle, repeatedly dealing with these same issues. Is that something that you've seen as you've talked to voters and officials across the state? And is that different from what you've seen in past years?
So I think, it's funny. So part of the reason why I believe Sharday said that, Sharday Jones, the mayor of Braddock, I had actually talked to her for a story about the 2022 Senate race. And it was because she was she stepped in for John Fetterman, who's running for U.S. Senate. He's now the lieutenant governor. When he ran, when he decided to, become the lieutenant governor, now he's running for U.S. Senate. So she, has been critical of him in the past. To talk to her for the story. And her point there is just like these cycles are sort of endless. And, me as a reporter, what I'm always trying to do is balance the fact that there are very important municipal and statewide elections happening right now. We're electing a bunch of justices to our appellate courts. We are electing, candidates for lower courts as well. We are voting on statewide amendments to the Pennsylvania Constitution. So those are vital things. But also candidates like John Fetterman, like Jeff Bartos, who's running as a Republican, like Malcolm Kenyatta, another Democrat, they're already raising massive amounts of money. They're already embarking on these really large campaigns that are going to last for more than a year as we get to the 2022 election. So again, as a reporter, you really have to, hopefully contextualize the fact that this money is already rolling in, that this giant machine that we've created of American politics has kind of started to churn once again. There was barely any downtime after the 2020 election. And so, making sure we balance those things, it's tough. And it's the world that we live in. And so for people like Sharday Jones, of course, that's frustrating. Her bread and butter, and the thing that she knows is that local elections, local politics, those are the things that most directly affect people's lives. But at the same time, because there's just this massive amount of money that gets pumped into campaigns like this, we have to be watching them and we have to know what the candidates are doing. So, again, this is honestly a campaign finance issue. Other countries don't run elections as long as we do or for as much money as we do. So, as you said, Solomon, there's a lot in that question. But I think, the broad scope of it is, yes, these same issues that were sort of just incensing people during the 2020 election, we mentioned before trying to get over it, but they aren't going away. Those still exist. And sort of the culture war element that was created in the 4 years of Donald Trump's presidency, that's not going away either.
Yeah, no, it's not. And so that brings me back to you, Susan, because Mayor Jones spoke about the importance of local issues as compared to this upcoming Senate race, even though one of the candidates used to hold her position as mayor of Braddock. So what besides schools should we be focusing on right now locally?
So, we all live in a municipality, and the people who are elected to run our municipality have an enormous amount of power. And in fact, a lot of them are the taxing authorities. So they actually decide a lot of taxation issues, and they really, in a very, very real way, determine our quality of life. So like I live in a borough, so we have a borough council, and we're going to be electing borough council members. We're going to be electing a mayor. If you live in a township, you're going to have township supervisors. You know, there's not a lot of zoning in Pennsylvania. There aren't a lot of zoning laws that are statewide. So your township supervisors are going to make really big decisions. Like, are they going to let somebody come in and open storage units on a floodplain? It's like, that's a local issue that we have right now. And until something comes and it is like in your backyard, I think people don't really pay attention to local politics until something starts to go south or something starts to go bad. But, you know, your borough council could decide to keep your town pool open or to close your town pool. And if you don't know who's on the borough council and who's representing you, you can just kind of like get a bad surprise. You know, your borough councils control your local police forces. There are just so many ways they talk about, they control who picks up your garbage. And so like in some communities, you change your garbage pickup people, and it really can actually be a really significant problem for people. So I think it's hard to find information, but for all of us who want to have a quality of life that is what we want, it's pretty important that we have people elected who are going to be working together in a bipartisan way to make sure that our communities are the best places they can be for families, for older people, for children, and not people coming in with a political agenda who are looking at the national level and just saying, oh, well, I want to come in because I feel like this is a place where I can have some power. And I think, you know, and often these are not jobs that are paid. They're not jobs, most of them aren't paid, and then some of them are, but they're not jobs that pay a lot. They're not jobs with a lot of glory. They're jobs where people sit around a table and make really consequential decisions. So in general, we have pretty good people in these positions, but it's important to engage and kind of know who's running and know what their agendas are. And again, I encourage people, if you see a slate running for any of these positions, to really kind of dig into that slate and try to figure out what they're really about. Because once you get a slate of people who have enough votes to have a majority, then you can have a group coming in that can take over and really push an agenda.
Okay, so one of the things that the mayor talked about was the ballot questions. And so David, I want to bring this one to you. So she's talking about an attempt to strip power from the governor when it comes to declaring states of emergency. Can you explain how these ballot questions work and how they're related to what happened in the last year with COVID?
Sure. Well, the table was set for these ballot questions because of the tussle that the legislature, which is controlled by Republicans, had with a Democratic governor about the terms and conditions of declaring an emergency and using that leverage to enforce mandates around business openings and cultural events and so forth and so on. And let's just admit, as in other things we're talking about, those emotions were whipped into a larger than life by the political winds that were blowing through the presidential race and afterwards. So these two amendments are there to challenge the power of the governor to act not quite unilaterally, but forcefully to declare emergencies and to sustain those declarations. And like most ballot amendments, they're worded carefully. So you have to pay attention to them. And I would encourage folks to go look at our website, 70.org, to get a finer grain close-up on those. But it really is about the balance of power. And if you believe that the General Assembly, with its 253 members, all told, is a better representative of the will of the people in enforcing these kinds of emergency declarations, then you'll vote one way. And if you think we need a governor who can act quickly and forcefully in that same manner, then you'll vote the other way. And it's striking to me, I don't know about the rest of you folks, I can't remember receiving direct mail about a constitutional amendment before, but I've got a couple of pieces in my mailbox, must be on somebody's list. I think one is for one way and one's for the other way. So maybe I'm playing it down the middle. But it'll be a very interesting test of the political perception and will of the people of Pennsylvania.
It will indeed. And, people are, of course, on both sides of that issue. And whatever position you take politically, there is no doubt that small local businesses were hit hard by those emergency shutdowns. Michael Garcia is a Republican from Franklin County, and he had this to say.
Now, I care about fairness in taxation. I care about promoting small businesses. It amazes me that throughout this pandemic, they've shut down hundreds of small businesses, yet Target, Walmart, Lowe's, Home Depot, big box stores, they have been given free reign to do whatever they want. And I don't see why it's okay to fill a big box store with hundreds of people, but yet a small mom and pop shop that sells shoes has to remain closed.
So Katie Meyer, the thing that jumped out for me in his statement was that he used the word plandemic. That's a word I've heard people use to express some skepticism about COVID-19. Was that skepticism there among both Democrats and Republicans as you talk to people throughout the state?
I mean, I would say, by and large, Republicans were much more skeptical than Democrats of, a lot of things, but specifically just the actual existence of the pandemic as a major public health problem. Polling has borne this out. What we've seen, for instance, our state legislature do has borne this out. Democrats, by and large, were, happy to listen to the recommendations of the CDC and, take public health precautions, for instance, wearing masks, including in the state capitol. You saw Republicans, it was very interesting, actually, because covering this in the early days of the pandemic, immediately there was quite a lot of bipartisan consensus in Pennsylvania and around the country. Remember, we had, a stimulus bill that passed pretty easily, pretty quickly on the federal level, and then Pennsylvania lawmakers rallied again very quickly to disperse that money. So early on, there was consensus, and I think everybody acknowledged that there was a public health crisis happening. As this issue went on, as many issues do, it became very partisan. And so then you started to see these coalitions of mostly Republicans saying that masks are government overreach, requirements for wearing masks, things like that. Now, of course, you'll see people saying that the vaccine should not be mandated. There was a sort of outrage over this idea of vaccine passports, which is not really a thing that ever happened, especially on the government level. There's a lot of misinformation out there. And I would say the word plandemic, it refers to a very specific video. We don't need to get into it because it was misleading. I would say there was skepticism of various elements, I guess, in both parties. I think some Democrats, for instance, now have been a little bit worried about these orders from the CDC now that it's okay to not wear masks outside. But by and large, I don't think there's really any comparison to be made. Republicans were much more resistant to widespread public health mitigation measures for the pandemic.
So, David, one of the other things that Mr. Garcia talked about was big box stores getting a pass. Is there a deeper issue here about who gets to do what based on their political clout and their campaign contributions?
Well, there's a long-running movie in Pennsylvania politics and in national politics about small is good and big is large. The specter of big business, Wall Street versus Main Street. So that's playing to a theme that has been exploited and repeated over the years. I'm not entirely sure that the details of what the gentleman was talking about actually play out, but we live in a time where the details somehow get swept along by, again, our beliefs and perceptions and so forth and so on. And there is nothing, having worked with small businesses at one point in my career, there is nothing more sacred that actually both sides agree on, that is the value of small businesses, particularly in communities. So But what is interesting, by the way, in the 50,000-foot jet stream of American politics is how Republicans at the national level are criticizing big businesses. Think of the uproar over Major League Baseball leaving the All-Star game in Atlanta and the reaction of corporate folks and so forth. Republicans criticizing those corporate interests who, frankly, have been very supportive of the Republican Party and filled the coffers of Republican candidates over the years. So this is going to be really interesting to see how that tension resolved, because it's kind of a head scratcher.
And Solomon, if I could just say one thing as well, just on the topic of businesses. I mean, I think it is interesting, to David's point. For instance, Biden's very, very sweeping jobs plan, it includes an element to finance a lot of these proposals on a higher corporate income tax rate, as well as crackdowns to businesses that are multinational, doing business overseas and then not being taxed on that income in the US. So those are proposals that Republicans have really rejected in the past, and we're not really expecting too much Republican support for them now or in the future. So yeah, again, there's this tension, right? As David said, small equals good, big equals bad. But that doesn't always bear out when we're talking about, for instance, corporate tax rates.
Yeah. So let's move on, because we can't talk about the political atmosphere and local politics without talking about the continuing fight for racial justice. Some think Democrats are the only ones addressing the issue, but Mary Nagami, a Bucks County Republican, she's also thought about the issue. And here's what she had to say.
Definitely leading up to the 2020 election, changed my engagement. Also, the summer of riots and more awareness of the racial discrepancies and the racial tensions and discriminations that are happening. Around that time, we had a lot of people in our area, which is more Republican, more supported Trump, kind of came up and claimed that there was no systemic racism. It wasn't a thing. We didn't need to combat racism in any way, shape, or form. So that really sparked my engagement, because I felt that that wasn't right, that wasn't just. We should be working to get rid of racism. Both parties should be working to get rid of racism. It's for the good of everybody.
So Katie, Ms. Nagami comes from a demographic that was talked about at length during the election cycle, suburban women. Now that the election is over, what are you hearing about how suburban women are thinking now?
Great question. So Mary was from the story that I had mentioned before about that Bucks County school district that was very divided. And just a brief background on her, because I think she's very representative of a lot of the people that I've talked to in the suburbs. She was sort of a very moderate, independent / kind of Republican voter. She liked Mitt Romney back when he ran for president, for instance. She was a registered independent. Now she's actually registered as a Republican because she wants to vote in primaries in her pretty Republican town. But she voted for Joe Biden and really supports him, feels more aligned with Democrats these days. And so I think for Mary and for a lot of suburban moms, this has always been a key demographic in American politics, these so-called persuadable voters. And Bill Clinton premised his election on quote unquote soccer moms back in the day, suburban women like this. So again, a crucial demographic, not the only crucial demographic, but in Pennsylvania, what we've seen is a gradual shift of not everybody, but a lot of people within this group toward the left. So, on social issues like, as Mary was saying, systemic racism, on issues like police reform, on issues that really kind of, run the gamut, but often are like social issues. We've seen a real increase in affinity for the Democratic Party, and that's a pretty new trend. So I would say, who knows what the future holds, but as of now, the patterns that we've seen, especially in national elections, not so much down ballot. We've seen some ticket splitting, for instance, among Brian Fitzpatrick, the congressman in the Philly suburbs, a Republican who's been hanging onto that seat. A lot of more moderate Democrats will vote for him as well. But it's really a strong trend that we've seen over the past decade that, white suburban women and men, to a lesser degree, increasingly vote for Democrats.
So Susan, this issue of racial justice that Ms. Nagami talked about, is this an issue that's coming up locally for you as you talk about education?
So it's interesting, just last week in Chambersburg, this issue came up kind of in a sideways way. So we do standardized testing in school districts. And part of the reason we do that is to see if there are any achievement gaps. And the state drills down into subgroups of students so that we can look at and understand who is performing well and who is not performing well. And so school districts, if they happen to have some subgroups of students, designated by race, by poverty, who aren't performing well, they get a designation, a federal designation, and they have to come up with a plan to try to address the reason, like the root cause for why this subgroup of students is not performing as well as everyone else, so that they can lift up the achievement of all the students. And it's a form of accountability to make sure everybody's getting a quality education. So in Chambersburg, the high school was targeted as one of these school districts that needed additional support. And it was because there was a subgroup of students, the English language learners, who were not graduating at rates that were, what they should have been. So the school board decided that they needed to use some of their federal funding, one-time funding, and do some work on diversity, equity, and inclusion training so that their staff and so that the school district as a whole could understand better a growing population of Latinx students who are coming into the district because they weren't performing as well as other students. So what is really kind of like a bureaucratic issue that really was not controversial ended up being picked up by the local talk radio station, the one that, broadcasts whoever, Glenn Beck. And they tried to turn it into this really divisive issue in the community, saying that the school district was going to support critical race theory, and our state representative reposted this inaccurate information, and they ginned up all of this ugliness among the community, saying, they're going to teach your kids all these bad things. Go to the school board meeting and tell them not to do this, when in fact, the information wasn't even correct. And it was a school board that was following rules to try to figure out how to make sure that all kids were going to be able to succeed in the school. And so in the end, they got tons of public comments. We've had a lot of Black Lives Matter protests downtown. There's a growing community of people who are really advocating for much greater equity and much more of a voice for people who have been kind of, frankly, silent and probably scared. And in the end, 7 school board members voted yes, and then 2 abstained, even though they should have had to vote no, but they allowed them to abstain. But I think it was just kind of, as we go into the school board election for the fall, I think people need to be really aware of who is running for school board and why they are running. And are they running because they want to support a school district that is going to ensure that kids can really get the experiences and education they need to graduate and be successful? Or are people running because they have an agenda that is based on something that has nothing to do with educating our kids?
Yeah. And so, you can't talk about the issue of justice, racial or otherwise, unless you talk about judges, because that's who often decides what justice is. Tiara Arrington is a Harrisburg Democrat, and this is what she had to say.
I will say in the past, it may, fell off of my radar, but I do feel like, this year it really is important. It's not just about, the people who make the laws, but it's definitely about people who see, different cases come across their desk every day. So I definitely believe that that's very important. We need people who, are more, I guess I want to say just, when it comes to making decisions on, different cases as they come across their desk, and not just really, looking at it black or white, but really looking at it for what it is.
So, Katie, are you seeing more people engaged in these judicial races as we talk about this issue of racial justice?
It's interesting. It's hard to assess voter engagement in judicial races just because these races do tend to have lower engagement than, for instance, a major presidential election. But so I talked to some folks from Pennsylvanians for Modern Courts, which is a group that pushes for various reforms related to the judiciary. And they were saying they're seeing above average engagement for one of these judicial elections, specifically for the Pennsylvania Supreme Court election. And they were kind of assessing that as like people were very, very engaged in the 2020 presidential election. There was record turnout in Pennsylvania, huge turnout across the country. And they're saying, it's very likely that that turnout has maintained, and they're trying to maintain it. They're trying to keep engagement high, tell people how important the courts are, because these appellate courts in Pennsylvania, we've got vacancies on the Supreme, Superior, and Commonwealth courts, 2 on the Commonwealth court open seats. And, so these are, not insignificant. These are judges who are going to be on the bench for at least 10 years unless they do something terrible and get kicked off. And I do think that there's reason to believe that engagement has been a little bit higher. But again, higher in this case is kind of a relative term.
Right. So, David, why for such an important position do we get so little voter participation or concern when it comes to judges, especially on the local level?
Yeah. Well, let me get to that, but I want to just tag on to Katie's thoughts. We've been electing appellate judges, Commonwealth Court, Superior Court, and Supreme Court judges for a long time in Pennsylvania, even though folks like us have thought for a long time we should be appointing those folks based on merit. And in fact, the Constitutional Convention of 67-68, to which my father was a delegate, that was one of his big issues to try to move that to a merit-based system. We're now seeing the political consequences of electing judges because I think a lot of folks see judges, they don't differentiate at what level, as all part of the political class, that they're all arguing things based on ideology and partisan advantage and so forth. And I'm afraid if there is an uptick in turnout for the judicial races, it may be driven by that. It's yet another instance of how the national trends that we've talked about have sort of percolated down to the local levels. But to answer your question, I think when you look at local level races, which are not, what I was just talking about, I think a lot of it has to do with people don't have much intersection with the judicial process, with the criminal justice process. And so they're not entirely sure what judges do or how to evaluate them. We have these, and we make judges run as Republicans or Democrats, even though they can cross list, which is, so when I pity the folks who are running for judge because you can't have an agenda or a position platform or whatever. You have to raise money. You have to engage in the sort of relationship building with the local party. And then you're left with talking to voters that have kind of a blank stare. And the best you can hope for is that you have a name that they can remember and they can find you on the ballot. It's an entirely unsatisfactory system, if you ask me.
Mm. Well, Susan, you've run for office. You've run for school board. You've also run for a House seat. How does politics and law play out in a local issue like education?
So I'm not so sure how the law plays out in it, but I think the politics play out in these local races in terms of like kind of public opinion. And so people run on what they think what they think people want to hear. So like in a state house race, if people support public education, if voters support public education, then every candidate in the race is going to run on supporting that issue, whether that is like the actual case or not. So I think if every candidate who ran and won supported public education like they say they do during their campaigns, we would not have the school funding system that we have in Pennsylvania right now. And so I think when politics filters down, it's hard to cut.
Okay, so we're having some problems with Susan's audio. So we're going to get back to Susan, but I do want to ask this viewer question. And this viewer question comes from someone who submitted this question. His name is Russ Kratzer. And here's the question. I'm still concerned about Pennsylvania courts and judges, quote, legislating, unquote, laws created by the elected legislatures in our House and Senate, for example, allowing mail-in ballots incorrectly submitted without verifying requirements on the outside of exterior envelopes or after the legislative deadline for receipt to be accepted and counted in any election. This is a legislative matter, not a judicial one. It's called separation of powers and part of checks and balances. Katie, I'm going to guess that question refers to the last election. When you hear that question, what do you think?
There's a tangled web of issues there, but yeah, I mean, there's no question that a lot of people view the courts as partisan instruments. And we should say, you know, a lot of the decisions that he's talking about, you know, they went to, for instance, federal courts, federal district courts, and a lot of the judges who ended up ruling on those issues were appointed by a Republican president, specifically Donald Trump, and he was the one bringing a lot of those lawsuits. So, you know, again, there were so many lawsuits during and in the wake of the 2020 election, so it's hard to, you know, parse out every single one of them. Some of these decisions that he's talking about absolutely came from Democratic judges. A lot of the lawsuits against the Trump campaign and Trump's administration were shot down by Republican judges that he appointed. So I think the larger question here is, you know, do people trust the judiciary? Do people think that the judiciary is overreaching? And in Pennsylvania, you know, for instance, we've had a Democratic-controlled court since 2015. That was when it flipped over. There was, a pretty massive upheaval in the court at that time. For anybody who doesn't remember, there was Horngate was the issue. It was a bunch of emails. You can Google it. But three judges there were three vacancies on the court, and that's how Democrats overtook it and will, for the foreseeable future, have control of the court. And so that has created a lot of dissatisfaction among Republicans. It got much worse in 2018 when they redrew the congressional maps. And, it got even worse during the 2020 election when the Democratic court, as our commenter indicated, they passed down a bunch of sort of emergency changes to the election law, 3 days extension for ballots being accepted, allowances that weren't explicitly in law. So a lot of Republicans, yes, have been very upset about that and have viewed it as legislating from the bench. I will say one of the responses that Republicans have had is something that will make the courts, almost explicitly more partisan. They are proposing a constitutional amendment. It hasn't passed on its second run through yet, but it has a very good shot that would make judges run not just in partisan elections, but in partisan elections by district. And I know this is something that David's been very invested in as well, but it just makes the judges act a little bit more, that much more like they're members of the Senate or the House. And so a lot of, good government groups have said, this is not addressing the issue that you seem to be wanting to address. Republicans say it would create more regional diversity in judges' opinions. So anyway, this is a very long way of saying that I think at the core of this question is a fundamental question, which is, can we trust our judiciary? And, people have been trying to solve that problem for a very long time. Many people think that merit selection is the way to do it. But again, this is a highly partisan and fraught issue right now.
Okay. So I'm going to move on because the question really is, how do we go forward from here, right? What's next? But in order to handle what's next, we have to deal with what's now. So Dustin Brace, a Franklin County Democrat, talked about the political conflict that came to a head in January. Let's take a listen.
Obviously, the election for me as a Democrat was good. I was happy that Biden won, and that made me feel like I had a voice again after 4 years of feeling like I didn't have one, especially living in South Central Pennsylvania, where there aren't very many Democrats. And then between the election and January, especially January 6th, I got more and more involved with writing to my representatives, trying to speak with people across the spectrum. In my area, there's obviously a lot more people that are Republicans and Democrats. And as long as I could have a civil conversation with people, I tried to talk with them about issues, especially issues that they thought were super important, like gun rights and COVID and vaccination and stuff like that, things that they thought were just going to be forced upon them or taken away from them. So I tried to talk to them. And then, obviously the 6th was really big. I mean, I'm a civil servant, so it hit home. I used to work in DC, very close to there. So that made me really feel like we need to make sure that people feel like they have a voice in government and that they don't have to go and try to take over the government because they don't feel like they're being heard. There are other ways to hopefully get their voices heard that don't involve killing people.
Susan, I'm going to start with you. Are there local issues that we can organize around across party lines, even after we've experienced this much turmoil? And if so, how do we do it?
Yeah, so, people love their public schools, and nobody wants to watch their school cut teachers year after year. They don't want to see their music programs go away. They don't want to see their art programs go away. And I can also say people don't like really paying property taxes. Like, they don't like seeing their property taxes go up every single year so that they can at the same time watch their school cut programs and services for kids. And so, polling shows that people in Pennsylvania really strongly support public education. And so once we're past this COVID, which we are past the COVID, there is just, I think, enormous opportunity for us to organize around getting the public school funding that our schools actually really need and deserve to take the pressure off of our property taxes, and talking to our state lawmakers about how much we need them to actually do their jobs in Harrisburg and get our schools the funding that we need. And so the school funding lawsuit is going to trial this year. It's going to be September 9th is the date when we expect the trial to actually start taking place. And so I think as we look at an inadequate and inequitable school funding system in Pennsylvania, we're going to be able to talk across party lines. And the other issue is on cyber charter school reform. So, we pay cyber charter schools $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 per student. School districts write a check for each student who goes to a cyber charter school. From the deepest red communities to the deepest blue communities, there is like strong consensus that this is a problem and that we shouldn't be paying higher property taxes to send money to schools that are going to use it to pay for advertising. So like every school board in Schuylkill County and Susquehanna County passed resolutions supporting these reforms. 400 school districts have passed resolutions supporting these reforms. And so there are a lot of issues about like better spending of money and in making sure our kids have the resources that they need at the local level. And I really think that people will come together around these issues all over and just say, like, we need to support public education in Pennsylvania because we can't keep going down the road we're going down right now. It's unsustainable for our kids and for the Commonwealth as a whole.
Mm-hmm. So Katie, Dustin Brace talked about January 6th, and I thought it was interesting the way that he talked about it, because he said, look, I'm a public servant, and it was scary, right? And so how are voters across the state talking about what happened on January 6th? And are they proposing a way forward on the things that we have to handle locally?
I mean, I think that there have been a range of responses. Unfortunately, as far as I've seen, they've been pretty partisan so far. You see Democrats not wanting to, not wanting to let go of what happened, making it a pretty central issue in their in the political points that they make and the negotiations that they have with certain Republicans who were supportive of some sort of an action at the Capitol. And I think you see a lot of Republicans saying, okay, it's time to move on. Let's not focus on this. We can, unity comes when we forget about it and move forward together. So, I mean, it's a good question, Solomon, but as far as I've seen, and maybe others would have a different response, I don't see a ton of common ground on that specific issue in terms of a response.
Hey, Solomon, let me just jump in, and I may be advancing the conversation, but I think this is a good time to make a plug for, and I've heard this from both conservative and liberal friends of mine. It's time to get back to basics and start teaching civics, real civics in the schools. It's not just memorizing dates, but asking people important questions about how this country has evolved and how we deal with challenges. there's a encouraging, in an encouraging fashion, there's a new coalition called PA Civics that we're a part of, that's actually being led by a number of former members of Congress from both sides, from both parties. And I'm hopeful that, you know, that movement can, again, sort of percolate back into the schools. So, I mean, both Susan and Katie, you know, have talked and you have talked, we got to talk about real things that happen to real people in real communities, and try to figure out in the messy American way how we resolve those things. And the more that, again, we can approach those from the ground up and not just sort of take our marching orders from whichever cable news station we're watching, the better we'll be. And of course, I think music to your ears and Katie's ears, local journalism. We just absolutely need to invest. I thought I'd get a thumbs up from that. We need folks to tell the stories about real people and real communities. That's the only way we're going to get out of this.
Mm-hmm. So when you talk about civics and teaching civics in schools, what exactly would that entail in your view? What do kids need to learn before they get out of school about how government works?
Yeah, here's a crazy thing. I can't tell you how many people I have heard when I get into this conversation who mention Schoolhouse Rock. You know, that after school session where you're like, all of a sudden you figured out how, in a very entertaining, engaging way, how a bill becomes law. You know, so we need to bring some creativity to this. Again, it's not this drudgery of, you know, when was the War of 1812, but just reminding folks about the mechanics of government, how things operate, what a borough council does, what a common police court judge does, and then, you know, throw in some field trips to make sure that you know what the local water sewer authority is doing for you. So we got to bring creativity and energy to that pursuit.
Susan, have you seen any of that taking place in schools? Kids actually learning about voting and learning about how government works, the different branches of government and their functions, and what that means to them as citizens. Have you seen any of that happening in our schools?
I mean, in my daughter's 8th grade class, they focused solely on local elections, and it happened, or maybe it was 7th grade. It was the year that I was running for school board. And so it was when we still had a local newspaper. And so they got the local newspaper in the school, and every week they would read the local newspaper, and it had information about all the candidates that were in it. That local newspaper is no longer here, so that's no longer there. But, you know, I think teachers do actually teach this stuff. Probably depends on how much time they have. It probably depends on how many teachers you have, what their class sizes are, what the district is, how much they're pushing, you know, standardized test prep versus, you know, civics engagement. But I mean, I think our teachers do a really good job. I do think there could be more supports that were provided. And if somehow or another there was a program that could provide supports to teachers and offer them resources, there are teachers who would hop on that in a heartbeat, because this teacher did the whole thing by himself, from top to bottom, because there wasn't any kind of pre-made curriculum and or any kind of like support to give him materials. And let's be clear, school districts, it's not like they have a lot of money for materials to buy new stuff every year anyway. I mean, she had a school book that had the Soviet Union in it that same year when she was in 7th grade. So, you know, I think that David's idea that there could be, I don't think it should be mandatory. I think if you like have some state mandate and another state test, then it gets ruined. But creating opportunities and incentives maybe could be great, because we have really good teachers in Pennsylvania who would probably really love to be able to do more of this with their students.
So again, I think we are, and we're moving towards the end of this program. And so I do want to get this in, because this is about what's next. And frankly, what happened on January 6th, very hard to forget quickly. 5 people died. And so, David, I want to ask you this. What role can local politicians play in moving forward from here, given that each side has its own really unique constituency?
Yeah. Well, that's the big question. And I'll just say parenthetically, I'm sure you all did as well, but I watched January 6th for about 8 hours that day with it. And it just made me sick to my stomach. I just couldn't believe that this was happening in this country. So it's just, we got a lot of work to do. You know, I'll go back to, maybe I've sort of riffed on this before. Let's get back to basics. Let's get back to local things that matter to local people. When you're running for, you know, city council, borough council, township supervisor, and so forth, don't just wave the flag of the party that you happen to be a part of. Talk to people about what the job is that you're applying for and how it matters to them. And the fact that, you know, there used to be a weedy vacant lot across the street, and through your work, it was turned into a playground that, you know, gave kids a place to play. So just a bit back to basics, neighbor to neighbor. I mean, I know it sounds like Jimmy Stewart, but Jimmy Stewart's from Pennsylvania, you know, so there's something there. I don't know how else we do this. And we haven't talked about social media somehow, for even though we've been on for over an hour. Like, turn it off. Just turn it off. Put it down. Push away from the table. Go talk to somebody instead, a real person. End of soapbox.
Okay. Well, it's interesting that you said that, because we had a question from one of our viewers, Russ B., who said this. He said, "Good afternoon. There's a lot of discussion related to the D does this or the R does that. For school boards, who cares about R or D? I want education-minded people. Instead of picking out the differences of R and D, how do we work to bring both sides together and listen, not just point, counterpoint?" So, Susan, it's about schools. I'll start with you. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, like, that is what actually happens on most school boards in most years, because you don't have a choice when you're on a school board but to work with the people who are on the board with you. So, you know, you can have 9 people who have really, really, really different backgrounds and different opinions, but you have to pass a budget and it has to be balanced. And somehow or another, you have to get down to the nitty gritty work of doing that. And again, like, the work that people do in these local offices is bureaucratic. It's not exciting. It's not glamorous, but it makes a big difference, and you're spending other people's money. And there is a big weight on your shoulders when you're an elected official and you know that you're spending your neighbor's money, right? And so, you know, that's why I just think that, like, in this year, I feel like there's a very big risk of people who have agendas on one side or the other running for these positions on an agenda. And then they're going to get into office and they're going to realize that, like, A, they don't really have the power to carry out that agenda by themselves. And B, they're going to bump somebody out who would have been a real team player, who would have been working for the common good of their communities. So, like, when you're running for these offices, you're running for the common good. So hoping that people will really look into who is running for these offices and just take a moment. And that's where social media can sometimes be helpful, because if you go on Facebook, most of us are old, and, you know, you can look up these older people who are running for office and find out who they are and if they have an agenda. But generally, school boards function pretty well. There are always the stories of those that don't, but I still have faith in the system. I really do. I have faith in the system of our local government.
Well, we are 100 days in on the Biden presidency, and he's laid out a vision for what he wants to do nationally. But all politics are local, and your voice is the one that matters most. So our panelists are going to take some of your questions now, because you're the voter and you are the most important person in our democracy. So let's take a look at some of these questions that we've gotten from our viewers. One of them is from Cindy Purvis, who says this: Pennsylvania has a lot of needs. Will a national infrastructure bank help the Republicans vote for an infrastructure bill? Okay, so David, I'll go to you first with that.
Well, that's an interesting one. Having just traveled a lot of Pennsylvania in the last week, literally a couple thousand miles around Pennsylvania, our infrastructure is in deplorable shape. You know, it's a state of roads and bridges and tunnels because of the topography and the terrain, and a lot of it is just it's embarrassing. And we haven't even talked about rapid, you know, mass transit, Amtrak, public transit, and so forth and so on. So we got to do something. I mean, if we want to do something, now we got to step forward and do it. And then the question was, well, who's going to pay for it? So this will be an interesting test. You know, if people really feel that in their communities, they feel like, I'm tired of driving on potholes. I'm tired of the bridge being out. I'm tired of the bus that never shows. And Biden comes in again with the national platform and an ability to borrow money that the local governments don't have. This will be, and this is, if that sort of, you know, shapes up, this will be an interesting test for his Republican opponents in Washington and in Pennsylvania.
The national infrastructure bill. So that's something that Joe Biden talked about last night on his speech before a joint session of Congress. Katie, how has that issue of national infrastructure that he brought up, talking about spending trillions of dollars to do it, how is that playing with voters across the state of Pennsylvania?
Is that to me? My internet connection's.
Yes, Katie, that's for you.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I think it's playing maybe along some of the lines we would expect, right? You saw a lot of Republicans saying that's way too much spending. The tax increases that are proposed are unacceptable. And then you do have Democrats saying, this is what we need. You know, the middle class in America has been hollowed out. We've got a gigantic wealth gap. Many long.
Okay, so we're getting a little bit of a lag on Katie's feed.
I think we need more money for internet infrastructure.
Absolutely. Absolutely, we do. And so when you talk about the internet and social media and all of that stuff, I wonder if that is part of what you talk about with infrastructure. But Katie, I think you're back. Go ahead.
Oh, maybe I'm back.
Yes, you are.
I don't know. I don't know how much you heard.
I didn't hear. I heard about half. Go ahead.
Well, I'll just make it. I'll just make it quick. You know, I think there are massive divides, but there is common ground on a lot of issues. For instance, infrastructure building, and that seems to be a starting point.
Okay. All right. And so when you talk about local issues, right? Somebody asked this question, and I thought it was an interesting one, and so I'll pose it to everyone. It's from a viewer named Ida B. Malloy, who says this: are there stakeholders on both sides who might be willing to create coalitions that can bring folks together? What seems to be the biggest ideological difference? Susan, I'll start with you.
You know, I think that there are coalitions that bring people together. You know, I don't know if there are going to be like new coalitions springing up to bring people together, but I think in general, we see people on both sides of the aisle in communities working together on a lot of different issues. And, you know, I would say even in Franklin County, there's a group called Racial Reconciliation that is very strongly bipartisan. It brings together people from the faith community. It brings together people from the business community. I think there is a recognition that the community needs to be more inclusive as things are changing. And there is a recognition, I think, on the parts of people who aren't on the edges, right? Like, I think we're going to always have people on the far edges of the right wing and the left wing who are not going to want to come together. But there are people who say, like, I want to live in a community where we're not divided. And when you live in smaller communities, you don't really have a choice but to be able to, you know, you go to the football game and you sit next to your neighbors. You don't want to sit there and feel like you're not part of the same community. And so, you know, there are Rotary clubs, there are, you know, all these different types of organizations that are actually very bipartisan. I don't think they're intentionally bipartisan, but they are just by virtue of the fact that they are community organizations that really support kids, they support little youth sports, they support everything that goes on. They've always been bipartisan, and I think they always will be. And I think that those are people who, as we get past COVID and you can get back to meeting in person with people, Your Lions Club doesn't have to try to meet virtually again. You know, all these groups that have had to try to go virtual, especially with older people, it's been really hard. So I almost wonder if we're not going to have kind of a renaissance of people who can finally get together to go do things and rebuilding our communities, because we're going to see a lot of money coming in too from the federal government into our state and local governments. And we're going to have opportunities, and that we're going to do things that will be good for all of us.
All right. So coalitions, David, how do they work in politics, and how do they work uniquely in Pennsylvania?
Well, I'll go on record, having lived and worked here, both sides of the state for a long time. I think Pennsylvania politically is kind of a center-right, center-left state. It's in the center. There's a practical, authentic quality about people that live in the state, whether you live in, Allegheny County, Philadelphia County, Franklin County, Lackawanna County, whatever. It's also a very local state. We are one of the national leaders in terms of the number of local governments we have, 500 school districts in addition. And so if that sort of renaissance that Susan talked about is going to happen anywhere, I'd like to think it would happen in Pennsylvania. And I do think that once people can physically gather together again, and there's more human-to-human contact, and that frankly, I think we would do well to get to a point where politics doesn't dominate our lives. We should be let's just talk about the weather, or talk about the Little League game, or the upcoming 4th of July parade, or all those kinds of things that make communities. So I'm hopeful too. This country's been through a lot. Pennsylvania's been through a lot. And by the way, the other thing we have to do, and I'll say this to you folks in the news business, we have to recognize and highlight our elected leaders when they use language of unity and coming together and bipartisanship and so forth and so on. Sometimes that, even last night's speech, there's sort of that whole talk about coming together, let's get to the raw meat. So we have to stand up for that and say that's what we expect of people in elected office.
So Katie, what do you think about the role of coalitions? And as you've talked to people across the state, have they talked about building these coalitions in order to get things done on the local level? Katie.
Can you hear me? My internet's quite bad right now. I'm not sure what's happening.
I can hear you now, yes.
Okay, great. Coalitions. I think in one of the places where I've seen some success is, for instance, in the suburban districts where you have people from both parties who are really, coexisting along these same political structures. I think you will see, those are the rare places where, for instance, in the state legislature, you will still see Republicans, for instance.
No, and she was just getting to the good part. Okay. So
doesn't that always happen?
Yeah, that always happens.
I was almost there.
You were almost at the good part.
I'm sorry, guys.
You said you see Republicans come together around these coalitions. You said Republicans. That's the last word you said.
So yes, for instance, the suburbs, you will still see Republicans jumping over in the state legislature, for instance, party lines, coming into coalitions on these issues like education, on infrastructure. And so I think, places where those, ties exist, that kind of shows us where there is common, that's useful information.
Okay. So, and it does come down to just regular stuff that happens on the local level. Things like potholes. How do you get a pothole fixed? How do you get trash picked up? How do you get your school repaired? Like, how do you get these regular things done? And how do we do that in spite of whatever disagreements people might have across these party lines? David, you looked at government a lot. That used to be something that could happen, and it still does in many ways, but it happens in this toxic atmosphere.
Yeah.
How do we change the atmosphere so that we can get back to fixing these regular things that everybody cares about.
Yeah. Well, let's hope that atmosphere is a toxic cloud that is getting blown away. You know, I'm reminded it's a little bit of feels like an old-fashioned saying, but that old-fashioned saying that there's no democratic way or Republican way to fix a pothole. Again, if we can remind people that, you know, government's supposed to do something. It's supposed to do something useful for children, families, communities, et cetera, and that we ought to expect that. I have some hope that the efforts hasn't always been perfect, but the efforts of the frontline workers in responding to this pandemic has really been extraordinary. And, you know, a lot of those folks are civil servants and so-called bureaucrats. And maybe if we started thinking of bureaucrats as hero-crats and the role that they played in putting needles in people's arms and making sure that people stay healthy, of caring for folks when they're sick. Again, if we can shut out the noise and just focus on the reality of the life that we see around us and recognize that, you know, it takes men and women who are underpaid and underappreciated, but who are willing. I mean, that was the story of the last election, by the way. And I wish we'd been able to learn more of that lesson. We delivered that election because hundreds of thousands of men and women around the country working for long hours and very little pay got it done. So I don't know any other way to lift those kinds of folks and their experience up.
So we have a question from a viewer named Robert Brand. He says this, is the unspoken national issue affecting local issues that several of our congressional representatives are trying to restrict voting and implement partisan gerrymandering while also still not acknowledging the results of the 2020 election? We also still have elected representatives who wish to ignore the assault on the Capitol on January 6th. How can media continue to focus attention on this assault on democracy? Katie, that question is tailor-made for you.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of ways. One of them is just offering this as context for, you know, a lot of the coverage that we do, saying, you know, this elected representative, you know, was supportive of, or, you know, rhetorically said that the pandemic was a fraud, you know, or, you know, was supportive of the events at the Capitol or downplayed them or whatever the case may be. I've seen some very specific examples, you know, WITF in Harrisburg, the public radio station where I used to work. Basically, if any Republican, because it was all Republicans, voted to delay the certification of the election results, they note that in a story, no matter what the story is about, just putting that on the record in perpetuity. So I think, you know, strategies like that, I mean, it requires newsroom buy-in and it requires a lot of, you know, careful conversations about what's appropriate. But I think those kind of strategies have been useful and helpful in, you know, kind of remembering what is important and the things that we thought were important at the time and not allowing those events to kind of fall by the wayside.
David, you've talked a lot about the responsibility of media on this event. So I'll ask you that question as well. How can media draw attention to these things that Mr. Brand talked about? Yeah,
well, I think I'd underline what Katie just said, and I talked about this earlier in the program, but, you know, you folks, you know, tell stories, and stories that have to be built on a platform of truth and evidence, and we can't get lulled into this, you have your facts and your reality, and I have mine. And you need to remind us of that and hold people to account. The other, you know, challenge we have right now is we've gone from a 24-hour news cycle to about a 24-second news cycle. So we forget what happened yesterday or even earlier today. And you folks need to remind us. I mean, Katie made a great point about how you can do that. You just to remember that this elected representative voted against, in the face of all available evidence, to refuse to accept the results of a legitimate election. So that's, you know, that's the job that you all have to play in as champions of local democracy. That's what we absolutely need going forward.
Susan, I'm going to ask you this one. It's from a viewer named Lisa Longo, who says this: as a former school board president, I was shocked when elected at how little discussion of policy was a focus of our conversations. How do we create an organization to help create policy and educate local elected officials on their responsibility to be good stewards of effective public policy and good governance?
Yeah, so for the school boards, we do have the Pennsylvania School Boards Association. So I'm not sure how involved her own school district was with that organization. I, as a board member and as our school district, found that to be a really helpful organization that actually did do training and now is mandated by law to train. All school board members actually have to undergo training. It used to be that you could just get elected and then you would be one of 9 people who would get to vote on a $50 million budget, $100 million budget in your community with no training. Now school board members actually have to be trained. And so I think that is a positive step forward so that we actually have people with a baseline understanding of what their roles and responsibilities are on a school board. So I'm not quite sure what this viewer's experience was with the School Boards Association, but they are there and they are actually a very good resource, at least for schools. And I think that you have like the Pennsylvania Municipal League, which offers resources to its members. So I think they're out there, but you might need to find them. And I think each elected group probably functions in a very different way, depending on who the president is, who the leadership is, how much time people want to put into it, how much they're going to be really focused on being a high functioning organization. And so it takes a lot more time to go to trainings and become a high functioning entity than it does to just walk into a meeting and vote. So I think the resources I think are there, but I think the elected officials need to choose to avail themselves of the resources.
Okay, I just want to take a moment to just reintroduce our panel. Our panel, of course, has been here and answering these questions from our listeners and our viewers. We have Susan Spka, as well as Katie Meyer from WHYY, and David Thornburg from the Committee of 70. And we're talking about what's next and how we move forward after such a divisive time politically. And so we have another question, and it's a simple question from one of our viewers. His name is Joe McCullough, and he asked this question: for the purposes of this discussion, what is unity? What is unity? Susan, I'll start with you, and then Katie, and then David.
I mean, I think unity is, if we're talking about like local elections, unity is working for what is in the best interest of the common good of the people in the community that you represent. And really working to find out how you can maximize the potential of whatever, if it's students in a school or if it's in a community, using those tax dollars you have to make your community the best place for the people who can live in it. I think coming together to support that is unity.
Yeah.
Katie?
I think, maybe a fundamental bedrock of unity, I would say, is just having a set of shared facts. For instance, is the pandemic a public health crisis? Do masks reduce the spread of, the novel coronavirus? And also just, having at least some starting point for shared goals. And, these are policy discussions that have gone on for a long time, but I think like they come down to things like, do we believe that Pennsylvania has, a responsibility to invest in public education? Do we, believe that our goal should be to make sure that people trust judges? Things like that, these fundamental conversations. Not everybody agrees on how to get there, but I think understanding that we are all kind of absorbing the same facts and working toward the same ballpark in terms of a goal, that it goes a very long way.
David?
Well, this is a great question. Americans, we're a cantankerous bunch. We got started because we had it with the oppressive regime of Great Britain. We were tired of being taxed without having a voice in our own taxation. So it's a country born of suspicion of authority. And that certainly played out over the years. You know, we've had lots of fights about lots of just about everything all the time, never ending. But I think now is a time that I hope we can gain a better sense of the shared values that we have as Americans, as Pennsylvanians, as people. People are social animals. We're social animals, and we live together and move together for a purpose. And I think now's the time we got to be focusing. You know, that great. I guess it's on our money, a pluribus unum, right? We sometimes I worry we spend more time worrying about the pluribus, about the things that we don't have in common, and not as much time on the unum. And I think that's the way forward if we're gonna heal these divides, which will never be healed. We're always going to be yelling and screaming at each other. But if we can come back to some shared sense of purpose, I think that's really it should be the only choice that we see in this country.
Mm-hmm. So we have one more question that I want to ask, and this is from one of our viewers named Blyden Potts, which says, is part of the polarization problem that we are less communal, less tied to other people in our local municipalities, less connected to civic groups and voluntary associations than we were a generation or two ago? David, you alluded to that when you talked about social media.
I mean, he's right. There was a famous and very influential book called Bowling Alone that came out, it's been probably 15, 20 years now, that looked at the disintegration of a lot of those social and community entities, like bowling leagues and like the Elks and 4-H and Little Leagues and so forth and so on. And along the way, you know, social media has created this thing called online communities, which I think have done wonderful things, but also reveal their limitations almost on a daily basis. So, you know, I look, it's easy to point out the challenges, but I do hope that we can remind each other of the things that we have in common and find new ways to gather and enjoy each other and have to have political disagreements without, as they say, being disagreeable. That's my hope. And I think that's, as I said, I think that's the only choice that we have really going forward.
Katie, what do you think?
I would really defer to what David said. I mean, yeah, there have been measurable decreases in the participation in civic organizations and community organizations. I don't think that that's necessarily lost. You know, I mean, I think there is room for people to find new points of common ground and common understanding. We live in a quickly shifting world. And as David said, a lot of these discussions, a lot of these sort of group relationships do seem to have moved online. I think it's sort of a pale imitation, but yeah, I mean, I'm just reiterating everything that David said because it's a great point. But I think these things are valuable, and in whatever way that we can find ways to meet as communities in ways that are not explicitly political, that's a positive thing. And I will say too, I mean, who knows, maybe post-COVID, when people are really, really ready for more social interaction, for more community engagement, these will pick back up again. I don't see why not. Might as well be hopeful.
I say let's argue about sports the way we used to, not about politics. How about that?
Susan, it's up to you. What's next? How do we move forward and really work together on these local issues? You get the last word.
So look, I think we all want to live someplace where we can feel happy and welcome, where we have what we need in our community, where if we're parents, we can send our kids to school and we feel really good about where they're going to school. We know that they're going to graduate. We want to live in communities where everybody wants to come and be and live in this community. So I do just feel very optimistic that, there were a lot of bad things that happened all at once. We became very polarized. We all got stuck in our houses. This is coming at the tail end of a lot of disinvestment in government programs from, decades of scarcity. And now we're seeing the American Rescue Plan that is going to inject a lot of money into our communities. We're going to be able to rebuild things. The scarcity that we saw in resources is going to be at least temporarily gone. And so I think we're going to be able to come out of COVID and start to rebuild communities and think about what it is that we want. And we're going to be coming together to do that. At least I hope so. So, I think what's next is probably a really, really good thing for Pennsylvania if we can all, start thinking about what's good for all of us and looking to a brighter future.
All right. Well, I want to thank all of our panelists. Susan Spka, Executive Director of Education Voters of PA, David Thornburg, President and CEO of the Committee of 70, and of course, Katie Meyer. She is WHYY's political reporter. There is a survey for those who are joining us. You can check it out in the comments section. You will also be getting that follow-up survey via email. And I want to thank you so much for joining us for this event today. You can learn more about WHYY and at WHYY.org, and more about the Pennsylvania Humanities Council at PAHumanities.org. Thanks for joining us for What's Next, National Politics at the Local Level, presented by WHYY and the Pennsylvania Humanities Council. I'm your moderator, Solomon Jones. Have a great evening.